The candles had barely been lit when Eleanor Whitmore felt the paper leave her pocket. She did not notice it missing until her sister Cassandra rose from her chair at the far end of the table, a folded letter pinched between two fingers, her smile sharp as a blade catching candlelight. The dining room of Whitmore Hall fell into a strange hush, the kind that comes before something breaks. "Before dessert is served," Cassandra announced, tapping the letter against her palm. "I thought our guests might enjoy hearing something rather amusing. A letter written by my dear sister." Eleanor's stomach dropped. She knew instantly which letter it was. She had written it 3 nights ago in the privacy of her room, pouring out thoughts she had never spoken to another living soul, sealed it, and tucked it beneath her pillow, intending to burn it the next morning. She never got the chance. Someone had taken it. Now she understood who. Around the table sat 12 guests, invited by her father to celebrate the harvest season. Among them the newly arrived Duke of Ashford, a man Eleanor had exchanged perhaps 10 words with since his arrival that afternoon. He sat near the head of the table, quiet, observant, a glass of wine untouched before him. Eleanor had barely registered his presence until this moment, when every eye in the room, including his, turned toward her sister and the letter in her hand. "Cassandra," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level, though her pulse hammered in her throat. "Give that back to me." "Oh, don't be so serious," Cassandra said with a laugh that did not reach her eyes. "It's only a bit of fun." "I'm sure everyone would love to hear what our quiet little Eleanor really thinks." Their mother, Lady Whitmore, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but said nothing. Their father was engaged in conversation with the gentleman beside him, and had not yet noticed the tension building at the other end of the table. Eleanor understood, in that instant, that no one was going to stop this. She would have to stop it herself, or endure it. Cassandra unfolded the letter with theatrical slowness, clearing her throat, as though she were about to perform on a stage. "Dearest diary," she began, her voice pitched to Carrie, mocking the private, tender tone Eleanor had used when she wrote those words. "I do not know how much longer I can bear watching him look at her instead of me." A ripple of quiet laughter moved around the table. Eleanor felt her face grow hot, her hands curling into fists beneath the tablecloth where no one could see them. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and vanish from the room entirely. But she remained still, her spine straight, refusing to give her sister the satisfaction of watching her crumble. "I have loved him since before I understood what love even meant," Cassandra continued reading, savoring each word, drawing out the syllables. "And when he chose her over me, I felt something inside me break that I do not think will ever be whole again." The guests were no longer laughing. Something in the raw honesty of the words had shifted the mood in the room from amusement to discomfort. Even Cassandra seemed to sense it, though she pressed on, unwilling to abandon her moment of triumph. "I am tired of being the sister no one notices. I am tired of smiling when I want to weep. I am tired of pretending that being overlooked does not wound me every single day." Eleanor's eyes stung, but she blinked hard and refused to let a single tear fall. She would not cry in front of these people. She would not give her sister that victory, not tonight, not ever. It was then that the Duke of Ashford spoke for the first time since the letter had been produced. His voice was calm, low, and carried an authority that silenced the room more effectively than any shout could have. "That's enough," he said, not harshly, but with a quiet finality that made Cassandra pause mid-breath, the next line of the letter still on her tongue. Cassandra blinked at him, clearly startled. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace?" "I said that's enough," he repeated, setting down his wineglass with deliberate care. "A private letter is meant to remain private. I think we have all heard quite enough of what was never meant for our ears." The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Eleanor stared at him, stunned, uncertain whether to feel grateful or mortified that a stranger had intervened on her behalf in front of everyone she knew. Cassandra recovered quickly, forcing a light laugh, though her cheeks had reddened. "Of course, Your Grace. I only meant it in jest. Eleanor knows I would never truly wish to embarrass her." "And yet," the Duke said, his gaze steady on Eleanor now, rather than her sister, "she looks rather embarrassed to me." No one at the table said a word. Eleanor's mother finally seemed to register the scene unfolding, and opened her mouth as though to intervene, but the Duke continued speaking before she could. "Lady Eleanor," he said, turning fully toward her, his tone gentling, though it lost none of its steadiness, "I confess, I would rather hear the rest of that story from you, in your own words, than from a letter read aloud by someone else, if you are willing to share it." Every eye in the room turned to Eleanor. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing pressing down on her shoulders. Cassandra's mouth had fallen open slightly, the folded letter now forgotten in her hand. Her moment of cruelty transformed into something else entirely, something she had not planned for. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse, to excuse herself from the table, and retreat to the solitude of her room, where she could finally let the tears fall in private. But something about the way the Duke looked at her, not with pity, not with amusement, but with genuine interest, made her hesitate. She thought of all the years she had spent shrinking herself smaller and smaller so that Cassandra could shine brighter. She thought of every dinner where she had sat quietly while her sister commanded the room, every ball where she had watched from the edges while Cassandra danced beneath the chandeliers. She thought of the words in that letter, words she had been too afraid to speak aloud, until a stranger had just given her the opening to do exactly that. "Very well," Eleanor said, and her voice, though quiet, did not waver. "I will tell it." Cassandra's expression flickered with something close to alarm. She had expected humiliation, tears, retreat. She had not expected her sister to accept the invitation to speak. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair, smoothing the front of her gown with hands that had finally stopped trembling. She looked around the table at the faces watching her, some curious, some uncomfortable, one steady and encouraging. "3 years ago," she began, "I was engaged to be married." A murmur passed through the room. This was clearly news to several of the guests, though Eleanor's parents exchanged a quick, uneasy glance that told her they, at least, remembered. "His name does not matter anymore," she continued, "but he was a good man, or so I believed at the time. We were to be married in the spring, after the season ended. I loved him, or I believed I did, with the sort of certainty that only exists before you have been tested by disappointment." She paused, gathering herself, aware that the room had gone utterly silent, hanging on her words in a way it had never hung on anything she had said before. "My sister met him at a ball I did not attend, having taken ill that week. She charmed him, as she charms everyone, and within a month, he had broken our engagement to pursue her instead. She did not know, at first, that he had been engaged to me, or so she claims." Cassandra's face had gone pale. "Eleanor, this is not the time." "You made it the time," Eleanor said, turning to face her sister directly, "when you decided to read my private letter aloud for the entertainment of our guests. So now you will hear the rest of the story, whether it comforts you or not." The Duke watched this exchange with quiet attention, saying nothing, but Eleanor could feel his presence like an anchor, steadying her, giving her the courage to continue. "When I told her the truth, that he had been mine first, she laughed. She told me I should be grateful someone as dull as I could ever catch a man's attention at all, and that perhaps this was simply proof he had realized his mistake. She married the sentiment, if not the exact words, into every conversation we had for months afterward." "That is not what happened," Cassandra said, though her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "It is precisely what happened," Eleanor replied, "and you know it as well as I do. I wrote that letter because I have never been permitted to speak these words aloud in this house. Every time I have tried, I have been told I am imagining things, or exaggerating, or simply too sensitive. So I wrote it down instead, because paper does not interrupt, and paper does not tell me I am wrong about my own feelings." Lady Whitmore's hand had risen to cover her mouth. Whether from shock or shame, Eleanor could not tell, and in that moment, she found she did not particularly care. The Duke leaned forward slightly. "And the man in question," he said carefully, "he chose your sister over you, despite the prior engagement." "He did," Eleanor said. "Within a fortnight of meeting her, I do not know if he ever truly loved either of us. I have come to believe he loved the idea of being chosen, and my sister, better than I, understood how to make a man feel chosen." Cassandra's composure finally cracked. "That is unfair. You make it sound as though I stole him deliberately, as though I planned it." "Did you not know we were engaged?" Eleanor asked quietly. The silence that followed answered the question more thoroughly than any words could have. Cassandra's eyes darted around the table, searching for support and finding none. Even the guests who had laughed along with her reading moments before now regarded her with something closer to disapproval. I knew, Cassandra finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew, and I pursued him regardless. The admission seemed to cost her greatly, and for a moment, Eleanor almost felt sorry for her, almost reached across the years of resentment to offer some form of comfort. But she remembered the sound of her sister's laughter that day, 3 years ago, and the memory hardened her resolve. Thank you for finally saying it, Eleanor said simply, and sat back down. The Duke of Ashford regarded her with an expression Eleanor could not quite name, something between admiration and quiet resolve. Lady Eleanor, he said, I think you have shown more courage tonight than most people manage in a lifetime. She looked at him, this stranger who had appeared at her family's table only hours ago, and had already, in the space of a single conversation, changed the entire trajectory of her evening. I only told the truth, she said. It seemed the letter deserved that much. Truth, the Duke said, is a rare currency in rooms like this one. I find I would like to hear more of yours, Lady Eleanor, when you are willing to share it. Eleanor did not know, in that moment, what to make of his words, or the warmth that had begun to unfurl somewhere beneath her ribs, despite the humiliation of the evening. She only knew that for the first time in 3 years, she had spoken her own story aloud, in her own voice, and the world had not ended because of it. Dinner resumed eventually, the conversation stiff and careful, guests exchanging glances that suggested they would be discussing this evening for weeks to come. Cassandra excused herself before dessert was served, claiming a sudden headache, and did not return to the table. Eleanor remained, straight-backed and composed, aware of the Duke's occasional glances from across the table, glances that felt less like curiosity now, and more like genuine interest. When the meal finally ended, and the guests began to disperse into the drawing room for tea, Eleanor found herself lingering near the window, watching the last light fade from the autumn sky. She had expected to feel emptied out by the evening's events, exhausted by the exposure of secrets she had guarded so carefully for so long. Instead, she felt something unfamiliar and startling. She felt lighter. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of that broken engagement in silence, watching her sister claim victories that had once belonged to her, swallowing her hurt because no one in her family seemed willing to acknowledge it existed. Tonight, for reasons she did not fully understand, a stranger had given her permission to stop swallowing it. She did not yet know what would come of the Duke's interest, whether it would prove to be nothing more than a passing kindness offered to a stranger in distress, or something more lasting. But as she stood at the window, watching candlelight flicker against the darkening glass, she allowed herself, for the first time in a very long while, to hope that her story was not yet finished, and that perhaps the next chapter might finally belong entirely to her. A door slammed upstairs before the tea tray had even been cleared away. Eleanor flinched at the sound, recognizing the particular fury behind it as belonging to her sister. Cassandra's headache, it seemed, had not kept her confined to her room after all. Within minutes, footsteps came pounding down the staircase, and Cassandra appeared in the doorway of the drawing room, her eyes red-rimmed but blazing with anger rather than sorrow. A word, Eleanor, she said, her voice tight with barely restrained fury. Now. The remaining guests exchanged uneasy glances. Lady Whitmore rose halfway from her seat, as though to intervene, but the Duke, standing near the mantel, caught her eye and gave the smallest shake of his head. Eleanor noticed the exchange, though she said nothing about it, and followed her sister out into the hallway, closing the drawing room door behind her. "How dare you," Cassandra hissed the moment they were alone, "humiliate me in front of everyone." Eleanor stared at her sister, genuinely astonished. "You humiliated yourself, Cassandra. I only answered the question I was asked. You could have refused. You could have laughed it off, made light of it, the way I intended it to be taken. Instead, you turned it into a spectacle, painted me as some sort of villain in front of the Duke of Ashford, of all people. I painted you as exactly what you were," Eleanor said, keeping her voice low but steady. "I did not invent a single word of what happened 3 years ago. You knew Edmund was engaged to me. You pursued him anyway. Those are simply facts, Cassandra, not accusations." Cassandra's jaw tightened. For a moment, Eleanor thought her sister might strike her, something she had never done, not even in their most heated childhood quarrels. Instead, Cassandra took a step back, drawing herself up with the practiced composure she wore, like armor in public. "You have always been jealous of me," she said. "Ever since we were children. Mother and father have always doted on me more, and you have resented it your entire life. Tonight was simply your chance to finally punish me for it. I am not jealous of you, Eleanor said, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were entirely true. I am tired. Tired of being made small, so that you can feel large. Tired of watching you take what you want without any thought for who it might hurt. You have always assumed that because you were prettier, or louder, or more charming in company, that you were entitled to whatever caught your eye, even when what caught your eye already belonged to someone else. Cassandra's eyes filled with tears, though whether from genuine remorse or wounded pride, Eleanor could not say. I did love him, she said quietly. Perhaps not at first. Perhaps I only wanted him because you had him. I do not know anymore. But by the time we married, I did love him. This admission struck Eleanor with unexpected force. She had known, of course, that Cassandra and Edmund had wed within the year, a fact that had been quietly acknowledged in the family, but never openly discussed at gatherings, as though everyone had agreed to pretend it had simply happened, rather than been engineered. Are you happy? Eleanor asked, and she found she genuinely wanted to know the answer, despite everything. Cassandra's composure finally shattered completely. She sank onto the small bench positioned along the hallway wall, pressing her hands to her face. No, she admitted, her voice muffled. He is cold to me most days. He drinks more than he used to. I do not think he has ever forgiven himself for what he did to you, and I think, in some strange way, he punishes me for it, instead of himself. Eleanor stood very still, absorbing this revelation. Some deep, wounded part of her wanted to feel vindicated, to feel that justice had finally been served after 3 years of watching her sister parade her stolen happiness. But looking at Cassandra now, hunched and diminished on the hallway bench, she felt only a hollow sort of sadness. I am sorry to hear that, Eleanor said, and found that she meant it. Cassandra looked up at her, startled. You are sorry? After everything I did to you? I did not say I have forgiven you, Eleanor clarified. I said I am sorry you are unhappy. Those are not the same thing. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant murmur of conversation drifting from the drawing room. Cassandra wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, an unusually unguarded gesture for a woman who prided herself on always appearing perfectly composed. What do you intend to do now? Cassandra asked finally. Will you tell mother and father everything? Will you ruin what remains of my marriage, along with my reputation? Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. I do not intend to do anything further, Cassandra. I said what needed to be said at dinner, because you forced my hand by reading my private letter aloud. I have no wish to continue tearing at old wounds beyond that. But I will also no longer pretend, for your comfort or anyone else's, that nothing happened. I will no longer smile through gatherings while you make small remarks about my prospects, my quietness, my supposed dullness. That ends tonight. Cassandra nodded slowly, though her expression remained guarded, unconvinced that her sister's newfound resolve would hold. And the Duke? She asked, an edge creeping back into her voice, despite her tears. What do you intend to do about him? I do not intend anything, Eleanor said honestly. He showed me a kindness tonight, that is all. I have no expectations beyond that. But even as she said it, she felt a small flutter of uncertainty in her chest, an awareness that the Duke's interest, however brief it might prove to be, had shifted something within her that she did not yet fully understand. Cassandra rose from the bench, smoothing her skirts with hands that still trembled slightly. Be careful, Eleanor, she said. Men like the Duke of Ashford do not simply take interest in quiet, overlooked women without reason. He is wealthy, titled, and by all accounts still unmarried at 32, which in itself should tell you something is unusual about him. I would not want to see you hurt again. Your concern is noted, Eleanor said, though the words carried more coolness than gratitude. But I think I am capable of judging a man's character for myself now, after everything I have learned these past 3 years. With that, she turned and walked back toward the drawing room, leaving her sister standing alone in the dim hallway. As Eleanor's hand closed around the door handle, she paused, steadying her breath, before stepping back into the room, full of curious eyes and half-finished conversations. The Duke was still standing near the mantel where she had left him, though he had drifted slightly closer to the door, as though he had been waiting for her return. Their eyes met across the room, and something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the strange, charged evening they had both witnessed unfold. "Is everything quite settled?" he asked quietly as she approached, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it. "As settled as it is likely to become tonight," Eleanor replied, managing a small, tired smile. "You handled that with remarkable grace," he said. "Both the letter and, I suspect, whatever conversation just took place in the hallway. You are very observant, Your Grace. I find it useful, in company such as this," he said, glancing briefly around the room at the remaining guests, several of whom were still watching Eleanor with poorly disguised curiosity. "Most people say a great deal without speaking a single word aloud, if one only pays attention." Eleanor studied him for a moment, this quiet, watchful man who had, within the span of a single evening, upended everything she thought she understood about how the night would unfold. "And what do I say? Without speaking, Your Grace." The Duke's expression shifted, something warmer entering his gaze. "That you have been underestimated for a very long time, by people who should have known better, and that you are far stronger than any of them ever gave you credit for." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, though this time it was not shame that caused it. Before she could formulate a response, her father's voice rose from across the room, calling for the guests to gather for a final round of cards before the evening concluded. The Duke inclined his head toward her, a silent promise that their conversation was not finished, merely paused, before moving to join the others. Eleanor remained near the window a moment longer, watching him go, and found herself, for the first time in 3 long years, looking forward to whatever the next day might bring. Morning arrived with a sharp knock on Eleanor's bedroom door before she had even finished dressing. Her lady's maid, Bess, hurried in with a tray of chocolate and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Miss Eleanor, you will never guess," Bess said, setting the tray down so hastily that the cup rattled against its saucer. "The Duke of Ashford has sent word this morning. He is requesting to call on your father this afternoon, and the footman who delivered the message said it was specifically to discuss you." Eleanor's hands stilled on the buttons of her morning dress. "To discuss me? Are you certain?" "That is what Mr. Perkins told the housekeeper, and she told me. The whole house is already talking of nothing else." Eleanor's heart began to beat faster, a mixture of hope and apprehension tangling together in her chest. She had told herself the previous night that she expected nothing from the Duke's attention, that his kindness had been a singular act of decency, rather than the beginning of something more. But the news that he intended to call upon her father, so soon after the events of dinner, suggested otherwise. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing a pale blue gown that Cassandra had once dismissed as too plain for fashionable company, but that Eleanor had always privately loved for its simplicity. She arranged her hair herself, refusing Bess's suggestion of elaborate curls, wanting to appear as herself rather than as some polished imitation of her sister. By the time she descended to the breakfast room, her parents were already seated, and the tension in the air was palpable. Her father, Lord Whitmore, looked up from his newspaper, with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between surprise and calculation. "Eleanor," he said, folding the paper and setting it aside. "It seems the Duke of Ashford has taken a rather sudden interest in our family." "So I have heard," Eleanor replied, taking her seat, and reaching for the teapot, with hands that she willed to remain steady. "He sent word this morning, requesting a private audience with me this afternoon," her father continued. "The footman indicated the matter concerns you specifically. Do you have any notion what this might be about?" Eleanor thought of the dinner the night before, of the Duke's quiet intervention, of the conversation that had followed in the drawing room. She thought of the warmth in his eyes when he told her she had been underestimated, but she had no way of knowing whether these small kindnesses translated into anything more formal, anything as significant as a private audience with her father. "I could not say for certain," she admitted honestly. "He was kind to me last evening, during an unpleasant moment at dinner. Perhaps he simply wishes to inquire after my welfare." Lady Whitmore set down her teacup with a small clink. "A duke does not request a private audience with a girl's father merely to inquire after her welfare, Eleanor. There is something more here." Eleanor's mother had said little the previous night, retreating into uncomfortable silence throughout the unfolding drama at the table. Now, however, her eyes held a calculating gleam that Eleanor recognized from years of watching her mother navigate the intricate politics of their social circle. "Whatever his intentions," Lord Whitmore said, We shall discover them soon enough. He is due to arrive at 2 o'clock. I would suggest, Eleanor, that you make yourself available should he wish to speak with you, following our conversation. The remainder of the morning passed in a haze of nervous anticipation. Eleanor attempted to occupy herself with needlework, then with reading, then with a walk through the gardens, but found her thoughts returning again and again to the approaching hour of the Duke's arrival. She caught glimpses of Cassandra throughout the morning, her sister's expression carefully neutral, though Eleanor sensed the turbulent emotions simmering beneath that composed surface. At 1:30, Eleanor retreated to her room to change once more, unable to settle on whether her earlier choice of gown remained appropriate for whatever the afternoon might bring. She had just finished adjusting her hair for the 3rd time when Bess appeared at the door, breathless. "He has arrived, Miss Eleanor. He is with your father in the study now." Eleanor's stomach twisted into knots. She made her way downstairs slowly, pausing at the bottom of the staircase, straining to hear any hint of the conversation taking place behind the closed study door. She could make out only the low murmur of voices, her father's tone measured, the Duke's responses calm and unhurried, though the actual words remained indistinguishable. She waited in the small parlor adjacent to the study, her needlework abandoned in her lap, untouched, as the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. When the study door finally opened, she heard her father's voice, warmer than she had expected, followed by footsteps approaching the parlor. Lord Whitmore appeared in the doorway first, his expression unreadable, though something in his bearing suggested the conversation had gone favorably. Behind him stood the Duke, dressed impeccably in dark blue, his expression composed, but his eyes finding Eleanor's immediately, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Eleanor," her father said, "the Duke has requested a few moments alone with you, if you are willing. I have given my consent, provided the door remains open and I remain within call." Eleanor rose from her seat, setting aside her needlework with hands that trembled slightly, despite her efforts to appear composed. "Of course, father." Lord Whitmore withdrew to a respectful distance down the hallway, leaving the study door open behind him as promised, though far enough removed to allow the conversation some measure of privacy. The Duke stepped into the parlor, closing the distance between them with unhurried steps, his expression softening as he came to stand before her. "Lady Eleanor," he said, "I hope you will forgive the suddenness of this visit. After last evening, I found I could not simply return to my own affairs without first ensuring your welfare, and without expressing something I have been considering since the moment I watched you rise from that table and speak your own truth." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "What is it you wish to say, Your Grace?" The Duke studied her for a long moment, as though gathering his thoughts, weighing words that clearly mattered a great deal to him. "I have attended a great many gatherings in my life, Lady Eleanor. I have watched countless women perform grace and composure for the benefit of watching eyes, myself included, in the audience they performed for. Rarely, if ever, have I witnessed genuine courage, the sort that costs something real to display. Last night, you showed me that courage, and I confess, it has occupied my thoughts ever since." "I only spoke the truth," Eleanor said, echoing the words she had used the previous evening. "It hardly seems worthy of such attention." "On the contrary," the Duke said, "I think it is precisely the sort of thing that deserves attention, and yet so rarely receives it. Most people, faced with public humiliation, either collapse beneath it or lash out in anger. You did neither. You transformed it into something else entirely, something honest and unflinching. I do not believe I have met anyone quite like you before, Lady Eleanor." Eleanor felt heat rising in her cheeks, uncertain how to respond to such open, unguarded admiration. "You flatter me, Your Grace." "I do not flatter," he said, his tone carrying quiet conviction. "I have little patience for empty compliments, and I suspect, given everything I witnessed last night, that you have even less patience for them than I do. What I am telling you is simply the truth as I see it." He paused, glancing briefly toward the open door where her father remained within earshot, before lowering his voice slightly. "I asked your father's permission this afternoon to call upon you properly, to have the opportunity to know you better beyond a single dramatic evening at dinner. He has given his consent, provided it is agreeable to you as well. I would not wish to press my company upon you if it is unwelcome." Eleanor searched his face, looking for any hint of insincerity. any trace of the calculating charm she had come to associate with men who sought advantageous matches rather than genuine connection. She found none, only steady, patient interest, and something that looked remarkably like hope. "I would welcome it," she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. The Duke's expression eased into something close to relief, followed quickly by a smile that transformed his usually composed features into something warmer, more boyish than she had expected from a man of his rank and reputation. "Then I shall call again tomorrow, if that suits you, and we may begin properly, without letters or dinners or dramatic revelations to complicate matters." "I think," Eleanor said, allowing herself a small smile of her own, "that would suit me very well indeed." As the Duke took his leave a short while later, Eleanor stood at the parlor window, watching his carriage depart down the long drive, and felt, for the first time since the previous night's humiliation, that perhaps some good could yet come from even the cruelest of moments, if one only had the courage to meet them honestly. News of the Duke's visit spread through the household with startling speed, and by evening, it had reached beyond Whitmore Hall entirely. Eleanor learned this the following morning, when a letter arrived from her aunt, Lady Prescott, who lived 2 counties away, and had somehow already heard whispers of the previous night's dinner and the Duke's subsequent call. "Word travels faster than horses these days," her aunt had written, with evident amusement. "I hear the Duke of Ashford has taken quite an interest in my niece. I do hope you will write and tell me everything, in far more detail than the gossip currently reaching my ears." Eleanor smiled faintly at the letter before setting it aside, though the amusement was tempered by a growing unease. If news had already reached her aunt 2 counties away, it would not be long before the story reached every drawing room in the county, embellished and reshaped with each retelling, until it bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. She was proven right within days. At church that Sunday, Eleanor felt the weight of curious stares following her, from the moment she entered until the moment she left, whispers trailing in her wake like a persistent shadow. Mrs. Abernathy, a notorious gossip who lived in the neighboring parish, cornered her outside the church doors with barely concealed eagerness. "My dear Lady Eleanor," she said, clutching Eleanor's hands with false warmth, "we have all heard the most extraordinary things about your dinner party. Is it true the Duke of Ashford declared his affections for you in front of the entire table?" "That is not quite what happened," Eleanor said carefully, extracting her hands from the older woman's grip. "Oh, but surely there is some truth to it. My sister's housekeeper heard from a footman who was present that your sister attempted to shame you publicly, and the Duke came to your defense most dramatically." Eleanor felt her patience thinning rapidly. "My sister read a private letter of mine aloud, which was unkind, and the Duke suggested she stop. That is the entirety of what occurred. And now he is calling upon you daily, I hear," Mrs. Abernathy continued, undeterred by Eleanor's clear reluctance to elaborate further. "How thrilling for you, my dear. Though I must say, I never would have guessed you the sort to attract such attention. You have always been rather quiet, haven't you, compared to your sister?" The comment, delivered with the false sweetness of someone who believed herself to be paying a compliment, struck Eleanor with unexpected force. It was, she realized, precisely the sort of dismissive remark she had endured her entire life, the assumption that quietness equated to dullness, that anyone who did not command a room the way Cassandra did must therefore be somehow less worthy of notice. "I have always been myself, Mrs. Abernathy," Eleanor said, keeping her voice pleasant, despite the sharp retort she wished she could deliver instead. "Whether that attracts attention or not has never been my primary concern." She excused herself before the conversation could continue further, making her way to the carriage where her parents already waited, her mother's expression tight with the particular strain of a woman who had spent the entire church service fielding similar inquiries from other quarters. "This is precisely what I feared," Lady Whitmore said, once they were settled in the carriage and moving toward home. "The whole county now believes our family's private affairs to be public entertainment. I do hope, Eleanor, that whatever understanding you and the Duke are developing progresses quickly, if only to put an end to this endless speculation." "I would prefer it progress at whatever pace feels right, Mother, rather than being rushed simply to satisfy the curiosity of people like Mrs. Abernathy." Her father, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "Your mother is not entirely wrong, Eleanor, though her reasoning may be somewhat misplaced. The Duke has expressed genuine interest, and genuine interest of that caliber does not appear often, particularly not for a family whose circumstances are, shall we say, comfortable rather than exceptional. I would advise you not to squander the opportunity through excessive caution." Eleanor bit back her frustration, aware that her father's concerns, however clumsily expressed, stemmed from a very real anxiety about the family's finances, which had grown increasingly precarious in recent years due to poor investments he rarely discussed openly. A match with the Duke of Ashford would resolve those concerns entirely, and she understood, even as it wounded her, that this practical consideration likely weighed as heavily on her parents' minds as any genuine hope for her happiness. The Duke called again that afternoon, as he had every day since his initial visit, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the interruption to her troubled thoughts. He arrived bearing a small bouquet of autumn flowers, gathered, he admitted with faint embarrassment, from his own gardens rather than purchased from a shop, because he had wanted to bring her something that felt genuine rather than merely fashionable. They walked together through the gardens behind Whitmore Hall, trailed at a respectful distance by Eleanor's maid, as propriety demanded. The afternoon air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and for a while they spoke of inconsequential things, books they had read, places they had traveled, the particular quality of autumn light that Eleanor had always found more beautiful than the brightness of summer. Eventually, however, the conversation turned more serious, and Eleanor found herself confiding in him the encounter with Mrs. Abernathy, the whispers that had followed her throughout the church service, the growing pressure she felt from her parents to see the courtship progress swiftly. "I am sorry you have been subjected to such scrutiny," the Duke said, his expression troubled. "I confess, I had not fully considered how quickly word would spread, nor how uncomfortable that attention might become for you specifically." "It is not your fault," Eleanor said. "Gossip finds its way regardless of intention. I only wish people would allow us the space to determine our own path forward, rather than shaping expectations, before we have even had the chance to properly know one another." "Then let us determine that path together, without regard for what others expect of us," the Duke said, stopping beneath the shade of an old oak tree, whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson. "I have no interest in rushing this, simply to satisfy county gossip, Lady Eleanor. I would rather take the time necessary to know you truly, to build something real, rather than something performed for the benefit of watching eyes." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, a warmth entirely different from the anxious heat of embarrassment she had grown so accustomed to feeling in social situations. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more to me than you likely realize." "I think I realize more than you credit me for," the Duke said gently. "You have spent your life being overlooked, or worse, being made to feel small, so that someone else might shine brighter. I have no intention of adding to that pattern, Lady Eleanor. If anything, I hope to help you finally step into the light you have always deserved." They continued walking in comfortable silence for a while after that, and Eleanor found herself studying him from the corner of her eye. This man who spoke with such unguarded sincerity, who seemed genuinely more interested in understanding her than in being impressed by her. It was, she realized, an entirely unfamiliar experience, and one she found herself increasingly reluctant to question too closely, for fear of disturbing whatever fragile, precious thing was beginning to grow between them. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden path, the Duke turned to her with an expression of quiet resolve. "I would like to ask you something, Lady Eleanor, though I understand, if it is too soon for a proper answer. Would you consider allowing me to court you formally, beyond these daily visits, in a manner that might eventually lead somewhere more permanent?" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. 3 days ago, she had been standing at a dinner table, enduring the deepest humiliation of her life, certain that her story, whatever remained of it, would continue unfolding in the same quiet, overlooked manner it always had. Now, standing beneath a golden autumn sky, beside a man who looked at her as though she were the only person in the world worth seeing, she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet in ways she had never anticipated. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "I would consider it very seriously indeed." The smile that broke across the Duke's face in response was unlike anything Eleanor had seen from him before, unguarded and genuine, and she found herself smiling back with equal warmth, allowing herself, for the first time in years, to believe that happiness might truly be within her reach. The formal courtship began the following week, and with it came a new set of challenges Eleanor had not fully anticipated. Cassandra, who had retreated into cold silence following their confrontation in the hallway, could no longer maintain her distance once the Duke's visits became a regular fixture of life at Whitmore Hall. She appeared at family dinners again, her composure carefully rebuilt, though Eleanor noticed the way her sister's eyes tracked every interaction between herself and the Duke, with an intensity that suggested old wounds had not fully healed on either side. It was during one such dinner, nearly 2 weeks after the initial humiliation, that matters came to a head once more. Edmund, Cassandra's husband, had joined them for the evening, a rare occurrence, given the increasing coldness that had settled over their marriage. Eleanor had not seen him in nearly a year, and the change in him struck her immediately. The confident, charming man she had once believed herself in love with had grown gaunt, his eyes shadowed, his manner subdued in a way that suggested the unhappiness Cassandra had confessed to was not exaggerated. "Lady Eleanor," Edmund said stiffly when they were introduced, as though they had never shared any history between them at all. "It has been some time." "It has," Eleanor agreed, matching his formal tone, though she felt the weight of the Duke's attention beside her, watchful and steady. The dinner proceeded with careful politeness, everyone at the table clearly aware of the delicate history binding Eleanor, Cassandra, and Edmund together, though no one spoke of it directly. It was only after the meal, when the gentlemen retired to the drawing room for brandy while the ladies remained in the dining room for tea, that Cassandra finally addressed the matter that had clearly been weighing on her throughout the evening. "You seem happy," she said to Eleanor, once their mother had stepped away to attend to some matter with the housekeeper, leaving the sisters momentarily alone. "I am," Eleanor replied simply. "He is good to you? The Duke?" "He is." Cassandra was quiet for a long moment, turning her teacup slowly in her hands, not drinking from it. "I am glad," she said finally, and though the words came out stiff and unpracticed, Eleanor sensed genuine feeling behind them. "Whatever else has passed between us, Eleanor, I never truly wished for your unhappiness. I only wanted, foolishly perhaps, to be the one who was chosen, for once." "You have always been chosen, Cassandra," Eleanor said, unable to keep a trace of old bitterness from her voice. "By our parents, by every suitor who ever called at this house, by nearly everyone we have ever known. I do not think you understand what it felt like to stand in your shadow for our entire lives. But I understand what it feels like now, watching you step into a light I never thought you wanted, and realizing that light suits you far better than it ever suited me." The admission hung between them, fragile and unfamiliar, two sisters attempting, however clumsily, to bridge a divide that had widened over years of resentment and misunderstanding. Eleanor did not know if this fragile peace would hold, whether old patterns would reassert themselves once the novelty of the Duke's courtship faded into ordinary life, but she found herself willing, for the first time in years, to extend some measure of grace toward her sister. "Perhaps in time, we might find our way back to something resembling friendship," Eleanor said carefully. "I cannot promise forgiveness comes easily, but I am willing to try, if you are willing to be honest with me going forward." Cassandra nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I would like that very much." Their reconciliation, tentative as it was, did not resolve every difficulty that lay ahead, however. Word of the Duke's courtship had reached beyond the immediate county by now, drawing the attention of society more broadly, and with that attention came scrutiny of a different sort entirely. The Duke's own family, particularly his formidable grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, had apparently heard of his interest in a country gentleman's daughter of modest fortune, and had summoned him to explain himself. He arrived at Whitmore Hall 3 days later, looking uncharacteristically troubled, and Eleanor sensed immediately that something had shifted. "My grandmother wishes to meet you," he said, once they had settled into their customary walk through the gardens. "I must be honest with you, Lady Eleanor. She can be rather formidable, and she has expressed reservations about our match." Eleanor's stomach tightened with familiar anxiety, the old fear of being found wanting rising up, despite the confidence she had begun to build over the preceding weeks. "What sort of reservations?" "She believes I should be pursuing a match that strengthens the family's political and financial standing, rather than following personal inclination. She has several candidates in mind, women of considerably greater fortune and connection than yourself." "I see," Eleanor said quietly, feeling the fragile hope she had allowed herself to build begin to waver. "I want you to understand," the Duke said quickly, taking her hand in his, an intimacy they had not yet shared openly, that her opinion, however forcefully expressed, will not change my intentions toward you. I only wish to prepare you, so that when you meet her, you are not caught unaware by her manner. Eleanor appreciated the warning, even as it filled her with fresh dread. She had spent her entire life being measured and found wanting against her sister's brighter, more dazzling presence. The prospect of facing similar judgment from a formidable duchess, this time with far higher stakes attached to the outcome, felt like stepping once more into territory she had hoped to leave behind. "When does she wish to meet me?" Eleanor asked, steeling herself for the answer. "This weekend, if that suits you. She is hosting a small gathering at Ashford House, and has specifically requested your presence." Eleanor nodded, though her mind raced with anxious calculations, wondering what she might wear, how she might comport herself, whether any version of herself could possibly satisfy a woman determined to see her found unworthy from the outset. The Duke seemed to sense her rising anxiety, for he stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression earnest. "Eleanor," he said, using her given name without title for the first time, an intimacy that sent a small thrill through her despite her nerves. "I do not need my grandmother's approval to know my own heart. Whatever occurs this weekend, my feelings for you will not be swayed by her opinion, however forcefully she attempts to express it. I only ask that you trust me, and trust yourself, when the moment comes." "I will try," Eleanor said, though the promise felt fragile even as she made it. As the weekend approached, Eleanor found herself once again occupying that familiar, uncomfortable space between hope and dread, uncertain whether the story she had begun to believe in, the one where she finally stepped fully into her own worth, could survive the scrutiny of a woman determined to see her fail. But she thought of the courage she had summoned at that dinner table weeks ago, the truth she had spoken aloud despite every instinct urging her toward silence, and she resolved that whatever awaited her at Ashford House, she would meet it with that same unflinching honesty, regardless of the outcome. Ashford House rose before Eleanor's carriage, like something out of a storybook, its gray stone walls stretching far beyond anything she had imagined, its gardens sprawling across acres of manicured perfection. She felt impossibly small as the carriage rolled up the long drive, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap, despite her resolve to remain composed. The Dowager Duchess received her in a formal sitting room, decorated in shades of deep green and gold, seated in a high-backed chair positioned near the fireplace, like a queen upon her throne. She was smaller than Eleanor had expected, silver-haired and sharp-featured, but her eyes held a piercing intelligence that immediately made Eleanor feel as though she were being thoroughly catalogued and assessed. "So," the Duchess said, without preamble, once the formal introductions had concluded, and the Duke had reluctantly withdrawn at his grandmother's insistence, leaving Eleanor alone with the older woman. "You are the girl who has captured my grandson's attention so thoroughly that he has neglected 3 separate invitations from far more suitable families in recent weeks." "I did not intend to capture anyone's attention, Your Grace," Eleanor said carefully, seating herself in the chair indicated by the Duchess's gesture. "I simply spoke honestly, at a moment when honesty seemed required." "Ah yes, the letter incident. Word of that has traveled remarkably far for such a private matter." The Duchess's tone carried a note of dry amusement that Eleanor could not quite interpret. "Tell me, Lady Eleanor, what precisely do you believe qualifies you for the position my grandson seems intent on offering you?" The bluntness of the question startled Eleanor, though she suspected it was designed precisely for that effect, to catch her off guard and observe her reaction. She thought carefully before answering, resisting the urge to recite the sort of practiced, humble response she suspected the Duchess had heard 100 times before from 100 other hopeful young women. "I do not believe I qualify for anything, Your Grace. If qualification implies some checklist of fortune or connection that I might satisfy, I can only tell you that your grandson and I have found, in the short time we have known one another, a genuine understanding that I have not experienced with anyone else in my life. Whether that constitutes sufficient qualification for the position you describe, I cannot say. That judgment belongs to him, and perhaps to me, rather than to any external measure of worthiness." The Duchess's eyebrows rose slightly, and for a moment, Eleanor feared she had spoken too boldly, had perhaps ruined whatever slim chance she might have had at winning this formidable woman's approval. But then, unexpectedly, the corner of the Duchess's mouth curved upward in something resembling approval. "Most girls in your position would have listed their virtues for me, like items on a merchant's inventory, the Duchess said. Their accomplishments, their piety, their supposed suitability for managing a great household. You have done none of that. I did not think you were truly asking about my accomplishments, Your Grace. I believe you were testing whether I would flatter you or answer honestly. The Duchess studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before finally releasing a short, sharp laugh that seemed to surprise even herself. Well, at least you are perceptive, which is more than I can say for most of the young women who have paraded through this room hoping to secure my grandson's hand over the years. She rose from her chair, moving toward the window that overlooked the sprawling gardens below, her posture regal despite her advanced age. I will tell you honestly, Lady Eleanor, that I had intended to discourage this match. Your family's fortune is modest, your connections unremarkable, and I had hoped my grandson might secure an alliance that would strengthen our family's position, rather than simply satisfy his personal inclinations. Eleanor's heart sank, though she kept her expression composed, refusing to let the disappointment show too plainly. However, the Duchess continued, turning back to face her. I have watched my grandson these past weeks, and I confess, I have not seen him this animated, this genuinely engaged with the world around him, in a great many years. Since his father's passing, he has retreated into duty and obligation, rarely allowing himself anything resembling genuine happiness. Whatever else you may lack in fortune or connection, Lady Eleanor, you appear to have restored something in him that I feared had been lost entirely. Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, unexpected relief flooding through her at words she had not dared to hope for. I care for him deeply, Your Grace. I would never wish to see him unhappy for the sake of ambition or expectation. That, I believe, is precisely why I find myself reconsidering my objections, the Duchess said. Ambition and expectation have guided this family's decisions for generations, Lady Eleanor, and I cannot say they have always led to happiness. Perhaps it is time for a different approach entirely. The remainder of the afternoon passed far more pleasantly than Eleanor could have anticipated, the Duchess gradually softening as their conversation continued, inquiring about Eleanor's interests, her family, the incident with her sister that had apparently become the subject of considerable gossip throughout the county. By the time the Duke returned to collect Eleanor for the journey home, his grandmother's expression had transformed entirely, from the cool assessment of their initial meeting, into something approaching genuine warmth. She will do, Edward, the Duchess said to her grandson, using his given name with evident affection. She will do very well indeed. The Duke's face broke into a relieved smile as he glanced between his grandmother and Eleanor, clearly having expected a far more contentious outcome from the meeting. I am glad to hear it, grandmother, though I confess I never doubted Eleanor's ability to win you over, once you gave her the chance to speak for herself. As they departed Ashford House later that afternoon, the autumn sun casting long golden shadows across the estate's sprawling grounds, Eleanor felt a profound sense of relief wash over her, the tension she had carried throughout the preceding days finally beginning to ease. I confess I was terrified, she admitted to the Duke as their carriage rolled down the long drive away from the great house. You did not show it, he said, taking her hand gently in his. You handled her with the same grace and honesty you showed at that dinner table weeks ago. I should have known you would win her over eventually. She respects courage above nearly everything else, and you have that in abundance, Eleanor, whether you fully recognize it in yourself or not. Eleanor leaned back against the carriage seat, watching the great house recede into the distance behind them, and allowed herself, finally, to believe that the path ahead might truly be as bright as it now appeared, unmarred by the doubts and fears that had shadowed her for so long. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, delivered by a messenger Eleanor did not recognize, addressed in handwriting that seemed vaguely familiar though she could not immediately place it. She opened it in the privacy of her room, and felt the color drain from her face as she read the contents. The letter was from Edmund. He wrote of regret, of years spent mourning a choice he had made too hastily, of feelings for Eleanor that he claimed had never truly faded despite his marriage to her sister. He begged her to reconsider, to remember what they had once shared before Cassandra had entered the picture and disrupted everything, and suggested, in language that made Eleanor's stomach turn with revulsion, that perhaps it was not too late to correct the mistake he had made 3 years earlier. Eleanor sat frozen on the edge of her bed, the letter trembling in her hands, uncertain whether to feel angry, disgusted, or simply exhausted by the fresh complication this represented. She had only just begun to rebuild the fragile peace with her sister, had only just begun to trust the happiness unfolding with the Duke, and now this letter threatened to unravel everything she had carefully constructed. She knew immediately what she needed to do. She could not keep this secret, not after everything she had learned about the corrosive power of hidden truths. She dressed quickly and made her way to find her sister, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. She found Cassandra in the small parlor, where she often sat with her needlework in the mornings, and something in Eleanor's expression must have communicated the gravity of the situation immediately, for Cassandra set aside her work and rose from her chair with visible concern. "Eleanor, what is it? You look as though you have seen a ghost." Eleanor held out the letter without speaking, watching her sister's face as she read the contents, watching the color drain from Cassandra's cheeks in a mirror of her own reaction just minutes before. "He wrote this?" Cassandra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He actually wrote this and sent it to you?" "I received it, not 20 minutes ago," Eleanor confirmed. "I wanted you to see it immediately. I have no interest in his regrets, Cassandra, and I certainly have no intention of responding to whatever foolishness he imagines might still exist between us. But I did not wish to hide this from you, not after everything we have finally begun to repair." Cassandra sank back into her chair, the letter still clutched in her hands, her expression a complicated mixture of hurt, humiliation, and something that looked almost like vindication, as though this letter confirmed suspicions she had long harbored but never voiced aloud. "He has grown distant these past months," Cassandra said quietly. "I told you as much at your dinner party, though I did not know the reason ran quite this deep. I suspected, perhaps, that his unhappiness stemmed from guilt over how our marriage began. I did not realize he still harbored actual feelings for you, rather than simply regret over the manner of our union. Cassandra, I want you to understand clearly. I have no feelings for Edmund whatsoever, beyond what remains of old wounds that have long since scarred over. Whatever he imagines might still exist between us exists only in his own mind." "I believe you," Cassandra said, and Eleanor was relieved to hear genuine conviction in her sister's voice, rather than lingering suspicion. "This is not your doing, Eleanor. This is entirely his, and I intend to address it with him directly, this very day." The confrontation between Cassandra and Edmund that evening, which Eleanor was not present for but heard described in fragments over the following days, proved to be the final breaking point in a marriage that had clearly been deteriorating for years beneath its polished public surface. Edmund, confronted with his own letter and the depth of his wife's justified fury, offered little defense beyond weak protestations that he had simply been confused, overwhelmed by regret and unhappiness that had nothing truly to do with Eleanor herself. Whatever the truth of his motivations, the damage had been done. Cassandra, with a resolve Eleanor had never before witnessed in her sister, informed Edmund that she intended to seek a formal separation, unwilling to continue a marriage built upon such fundamentally unstable foundations. It was a scandalous decision, one that would undoubtedly generate fresh waves of gossip throughout the county, but Cassandra seemed, for the first time in years, entirely unconcerned with public opinion. "I spent so long trying to win a prize that was never truly mine to claim," Cassandra told Eleanor several days later, as they sat together in the garden, watching the last of the autumn leaves drift from the trees. "I built my entire sense of worth around having secured him, around proving myself the more desirable sister. I see now how hollow that victory always was." Eleanor reached over and took her sister's hand, a gesture of genuine affection that would have felt impossible just weeks earlier. "We were both shaped by the same foolish belief, Cassandra, that our worth depended on comparison to one another rather than existing independently. I am only sorry it took so much pain for both of us to see it clearly." The Duke, when Eleanor relayed the entire situation to him, listened with quiet, unwavering support, offering neither judgment of Edmund's foolish behavior nor undue concern about how the scandal might reflect upon their own courtship. "Your sister shows remarkable courage, choosing to end an unhappy marriage, rather than enduring it for the sake of appearances," he said, once Eleanor had finished recounting the events of the preceding days. "I imagine that courage did not emerge from nowhere, Eleanor. I suspect she learned something of it from watching you these past weeks." Eleanor considered this thought carefully, surprised by how much comfort it provided. Perhaps the letter that had once been read aloud to shame her had, in its own strange and circuitous way, begun a chain of events that ultimately freed not only herself from years of quiet suffering, but her sister as well, both of them finally stepping free from the roles they had been trapped within for far too long. As autumn deepened into the first cold days of winter, life at Whitmore Hall began to settle into a new, more honest rhythm. Cassandra moved back into her childhood bedroom, her presence no longer a source of quiet resentment, but rather of genuine companionship, as the sisters rebuilt their relationship on far sturdier ground than it had ever previously occupied. The Duke's visits continued with unwavering regularity, and Eleanor found herself, day by day, growing more confident in the happiness that seemed determined to remain within her reach. No longer a fragile, uncertain thing, but something solid and increasingly permanent. Winter arrived in earnest, blanketing the grounds of Whitmore Hall in a thick layer of frost each morning. And with it came a proposal Eleanor had begun to hope for, but had not dared to expect quite so soon. The Duke arrived one bitterly cold afternoon in December, his expression carrying a nervous energy Eleanor had not witnessed from him before, despite his usual composed demeanor. "Would you walk with me?" he asked, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Despite the cold, I find I have something important I wish to discuss, and I would prefer to do so somewhere private." Eleanor bundled herself in a heavy cloak and followed him out into the gardens, now stripped bare of their autumn color, the bare branches of the trees stark against a pale winter sky. They walked in silence for several minutes, the Duke's usual easy conversation notably absent, until they reached the same oak tree beneath which he had first asked to court her formally months before. "I have thought a great deal, these past weeks, about how to properly express what I wish to say," he began, turning to face her fully, his eyes holding an intensity that made Eleanor's heart begin to race. "I have considered elaborate speeches, poetic declarations, all manner of grand gestures that seemed appropriate for a moment such as this. But in the end, I find I only wish to speak plainly, as you have always spoken to me." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, and Eleanor felt her breath catch as understanding dawned. "Eleanor," he said, "I have loved you since that first evening, watching you rise from humiliation, with more grace and courage than I have ever witnessed in another person. I have loved you through every conversation since, through every small moment we have shared these past months. I do not wish to spend another day without the certainty of your presence in my life, permanently, as my wife and my partner in all things. Will you marry me?" Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, unable to speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the enormity of the question, and the certainty with which she already knew her answer. "Yes," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you, Edward." The Duke's face broke into a radiant smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger, a beautiful sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that caught the pale winter light. He drew her into his arms then, and Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time, to fully surrender to the happiness she had spent so long believing might never truly belong to her. News of the engagement spread quickly, though this time the gossip that accompanied it carried none of the earlier cruelty or speculation. Instead, the county seemed genuinely delighted by the match, having watched the courtship unfold over recent months with growing approval. Even Mrs. Abernathy, when she encountered Eleanor at church the following Sunday, offered what seemed like genuine congratulations, though Eleanor suspected some measure of self-interest remained, in the older woman's evident eagerness to claim proximity to the future Duchess of Ashford. Cassandra's joy at the news proved entirely genuine, free of any lingering trace of the old jealousy that had once poisoned their relationship. "I am so happy for you, Eleanor," she said, embracing her sister warmly. "You deserve every bit of this happiness, and more besides." The wedding planning that followed occupied the remaining winter months, and Eleanor found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, actually enjoying the process, rather than dreading it, as she might once have expected. She chose her own gown, selected her own flowers, made decisions about every aspect of the ceremony, with a confidence that would have seemed impossible to her just months earlier, before that fateful dinner had upended everything she believed about her place in the world. The Dowager Duchess, who had grown genuinely fond of Eleanor over the preceding months, insisted on hosting the wedding breakfast at Ashford House, declaring that the future Duchess deserved nothing less than the grandest celebration the family could provide. Eleanor found herself increasingly comfortable in the older woman's formidable presence, their initial adversarial meeting having transformed into something resembling genuine affection and mutual respect. Only Edmund's continued presence in the periphery of their lives cast any shadow over the otherwise joyful preparations. The formal separation between Edmund and Cassandra had proceeded through the necessary legal channels, though such matters moved slowly and remained far from fully resolved by the time the wedding date approached. Eleanor occasionally heard word of him through mutual acquaintances, reports of a man increasingly isolated by his own poor choices. His social standing diminished considerably by the scandal of the failed marriage and the circumstances that had precipitated it. She felt little beyond distant pity for him now, the old wounds he had once inflicted having finally scarred over completely, replaced by a happiness so genuine and complete that his existence barely registered as a concern in her daily thoughts. She had, she realized, finally and truly, moved beyond the pain of that broken engagement, transformed by everything that had followed, into something entirely different, entirely stronger, than the young woman who had once believed her worth depended on being chosen over her sister. As the wedding day approached, drawing ever closer with each passing week of careful preparation, Eleanor found herself reflecting often on the strange, circuitous path that had brought her to this moment. A cruel act of humiliation, intended to diminish her before an audience of watching guests, had instead become the catalyst for everything good that followed, the moment when she had finally found the courage to speak her own truth, rather than continuing to shrink into silence. She did not know, of course, that her sister's cruelty that evening had stemmed from her own desperate unhappiness, nor could she have predicted that the stranger who intervened on her behalf would become the great love of her life. But standing now at the threshold of a happiness she had once believed entirely beyond her reach, Eleanor found herself grateful, in some strange and unexpected way, for the very humiliation that had set this entire journey into motion. 3 days before the wedding, an unexpected visitor arrived at Whitmore Hall that threw the household into fresh turmoil. Eleanor was in the drawing room, reviewing final arrangements with her mother, when Bess appeared, flustered and pale, announcing that Edmund had arrived unannounced and was demanding to speak with Cassandra immediately. Cassandra, who had been fitting her gown for the ceremony in an upstairs room, descended the staircase with visible reluctance, her expression hardening into something resembling steel as she reached the bottom step and found Edmund waiting in the front hall, his appearance disheveled in a manner that suggested he had traveled through the night to arrive so early. "Cassandra," he said, his voice carrying a desperation that made Eleanor, watching from the drawing-room doorway, feel a flicker of unwanted pity, despite everything that had transpired between them. "I need to speak with you, please." "There is nothing left to say, Edmund," Cassandra replied, her voice steady, despite the tension visible in her shoulders. "The papers are nearly finalized. This visit accomplishes nothing beyond disrupting my sister's wedding preparations." "I have made a terrible mistake," Edmund said, taking a step toward her, though he stopped short when Cassandra's expression turned unmistakably cold. "I do not know what madness overtook me, writing that letter to Eleanor. I was drowning in regret and unhappiness, and I lashed out in the worst possible way, hurting everyone I claimed to care about in the process. I am asking for another chance, Cassandra. Please." Eleanor watched her sister carefully, uncertain how this confrontation might unfold, hoping desperately that Cassandra would not allow herself to be swayed by desperate promises that had, in Eleanor's own experience of the man, historically proven hollow and unreliable. "I spent 3 years trying to earn your genuine affection, Edmund," Cassandra said, her voice steady though Eleanor could detect the underlying pain beneath her composed exterior. 3 years, watching you grow colder, more distant, more resentful, while I convinced myself that patience and devotion would eventually restore whatever we once had. I am done waiting, Edmund. I am done believing that if I simply try harder, love harder, sacrifice more of myself, that you might finally choose me completely, rather than continuing to mourn a choice you made and now regret." "I do choose you," Edmund insisted, though his voice lacked the conviction necessary to make the claim believable. "I was confused, Cassandra. Overwhelmed by circumstances I did not fully understand myself. Eleanor was never truly the issue. I simply needed someone to blame for my own unhappiness, and old regrets seemed the easiest target." "That may well be true," Cassandra said. but it changes nothing about what I have decided. I deserve a marriage built on genuine, unwavering commitment, not one perpetually shadowed by comparison to a choice you continue to second-guess. I hope, in time, you find whatever peace you are searching for, Edmund, but you will not find it through me. Not any longer. Edmund's shoulders slumped, the last of his desperate hope visibly draining away, as Cassandra's resolve remained unshaken, despite his pleading. He glanced briefly toward the drawing-room doorway where Eleanor stood watching, and something in his expression, perhaps genuine shame, perhaps simple recognition of everything he had lost through his own poor choices, made Eleanor almost feel sorry for him despite everything. "I am sorry, Eleanor," he said quietly, addressing her directly for the first time since his arrival, "for everything. I should never have written that letter, and I certainly should never have broken our engagement in the manner I did, all those years ago. I hope you find genuine happiness with the Duke. You deserve it, far more than I ever deserved you." Eleanor accepted the apology with a small nod, feeling no particular need to offer forgiveness or absolution, content simply to let the moment pass without further comment. Whatever regret Edmund carried was his own burden to bear, not hers to resolve or soften on his behalf. Edmund departed shortly afterward, his carriage disappearing down the long drive, with a finality that seemed to settle something within Cassandra, a visible easing of tension across her shoulders as she watched him go. "Are you well?" Eleanor asked, moving to stand beside her sister at the window. "I am," Cassandra said, and Eleanor was relieved to hear genuine conviction in her voice, rather than lingering doubt. "I think, perhaps, I needed to see him one final time, to hear his pleading, and recognize how little it actually moved me, in order to fully believe that I have truly moved past this chapter of my life." "You have grown remarkably strong these past months," Eleanor observed, studying her sister with genuine admiration. "I learned it from you," Cassandra said, a faint smile touching her lips despite the emotional weight of the preceding confrontation. "Watching you find your voice, your courage, after everything I put you through, it taught me that strength is not about winning every comparison or securing every prize. It is about knowing your own worth, regardless of what others believe you deserve." The sisters embraced then, a genuine, unguarded gesture of affection that would have seemed impossible mere months earlier, before that fateful dinner had begun unraveling years of resentment and misunderstanding between them. Eleanor felt profound gratitude for how far they had traveled together, from bitter rivals locked in painful comparison to genuine allies, finally free of the roles that had constrained them both for so long. With Edmund's unwelcome visit resolved and the final wedding preparations proceeding smoothly in its aftermath, the household at Whitmore Hall settled into the excited anticipation that precedes any joyful occasion. Eleanor spent her final days as an unmarried woman surrounded by the warmth of family and friends, the Duke's daily visits continuing, despite the traditional custom suggesting the couple should spend the days before their wedding apart. "I find I cannot bear to be parted from you, even briefly," he confessed, during one such visit, 2 days before the ceremony, as they sat together in the parlor, reviewing final details of the wedding breakfast to be held at Ashford House. "I know custom suggests otherwise, but I have spent too many years without genuine happiness in my life to waste even a single unnecessary day apart from the source of it now." Eleanor smiled, reaching to take his hand across the small distance separating them. "I feel precisely the same, Edward. Whatever custom suggests, I find myself grateful for every moment we share, regardless of how traditional or untraditional the circumstances might be." As the wedding day drew nearer, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the remarkable transformation her life had undergone in the span of just a few short months. The frightened, overlooked young woman, who had once endured public humiliation at her own family's dinner table, had given way to someone entirely different, someone confident in her own worth, secure in genuine love, surrounded by a family finally healed of old wounds and resentments. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, she felt ready to meet them, armed with the hard-won knowledge that her voice, once found, could never again be silenced or diminished by those who had once sought to keep her small. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, unusually mild for the depths of winter, as though the very weather had conspired to bless the occasion with unexpected warmth. Eleanor woke before sunrise, unable to sleep further despite the early hour, her heart racing with a mixture of nervous anticipation and pure, unclouded joy. Bess arrived shortly after dawn to help her dress, and the morning passed in a blur of careful preparation, her gown fitted to perfection, her hair arranged in an elegant style that framed her face without the elaborate excess Cassandra might once have insisted upon. Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror when the preparations were finally complete, and felt a startling jolt of recognition, seeing not the quiet, overlooked girl she had once believed herself to be, but a woman fully confident in her own worth, radiant with genuine happiness. Cassandra entered the room as the final touches were being applied, dressed in a gown of deep blue that complemented rather than competed with Eleanor's own bridal attire, a small but meaningful gesture that spoke to how thoroughly their relationship had transformed over the preceding months. "You look beautiful," Cassandra said, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she took in her sister's appearance. "I do not think I have ever seen you looking so genuinely happy, Eleanor." "I have never felt so genuinely happy," Eleanor replied, embracing her sister carefully, so as not to disturb either of their carefully arranged gowns. "Thank you, Cassandra, for everything these past months, for finding the courage to be honest with me, for helping me rebuild what our cruelty once broke between us. I do not think I could have arrived at this day, this happiness, without that healing." "You would have found your way regardless," Cassandra said. "You have always possessed more strength than either of us ever gave you credit for. But I am deeply grateful to have witnessed it, and to have been given the chance to become part of your journey toward happiness, rather than remaining an obstacle within it." The church was filled with familiar faces when Eleanor arrived, her father waiting to escort her down the aisle, with visible pride shining in his eyes, an expression she had rarely witnessed directed toward her specifically throughout her life. Always accustomed to watching such pride, reserved primarily for Cassandra, the transformation in her father's regard for her felt like one final, quiet validation of everything Eleanor had accomplished these past months, proof that she had never truly been the lesser daughter, only the overlooked one, waiting patiently for her moment to finally be seen clearly. The Duke waited at the altar as she began her slow walk down the aisle, his expression carrying such open, unguarded love that Eleanor felt tears threaten despite her best efforts to maintain composure. She thought, as she walked toward him, of that first terrible evening at dinner, of the letter read aloud with cruel intention, of the stranger who had intervened with a simple request that changed the entire course of her life. "I asked you to tell me more that evening," the Duke murmured, once she had reached his side and the ceremony was preparing to begin, his voice pitched low enough for only her to hear. "And you have been telling me more, wonderful things about yourself, every single day since. I find I never wish that particular conversation to end, Eleanor, not for the rest of our lives together." "Then I promise you shall never stop hearing it," Eleanor whispered back, her heart overflowing with a happiness so complete it felt almost impossible to contain. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of joyful emotion, vows exchanged with genuine conviction, rings placed upon fingers with trembling but certain hands, the assembled guests witnessing a union built not upon calculation or convenience, but upon genuine, hard-won understanding between two people who had found, against considerable odds, exactly the sort of partnership each had long ago given up hoping to discover. The wedding breakfast that followed at Ashford House proved every bit as magnificent as the Dowager Duchess had promised. The great hall decorated with winter flowers and glowing candlelight, tables laden with delicacies that spoke to the family's considerable wealth and standing. Eleanor moved through the celebration on her husband's arm, greeting guests both familiar and unfamiliar, with a confidence that would have seemed impossible to imagine just months earlier. The Dowager Duchess found a quiet moment to speak with Eleanor privately during the celebration, drawing her aside to a quieter corner of the great hall, while the other guests continued their joyful revelry nearby. "I confess, I have rarely been so pleased to be proven wrong in my initial judgment," the older woman said, her sharp eyes softened by genuine warmth. "You have brought my grandson a happiness I feared he might never find, Eleanor. Welcome properly to this family, my dear. You have more than earned your place within it." Eleanor felt overwhelming gratitude at these words, remembering vividly the terror she had felt walking into this very house months earlier, uncertain whether she would be found worthy of the position she now permanently occupied. "Thank you, Your Grace. Your acceptance means more to me than I can properly express." As the celebration continued into the evening, Eleanor found herself standing near a window, overlooking the darkening gardens, watching the last light fade from the winter sky, much as she had done that first terrible evening months ago at her family's dinner table. But where that earlier moment had been filled with humiliation and quiet despair, this one overflowed with a happiness so complete it felt almost overwhelming in its intensity. Her husband found her there, slipping an arm around her waist as he joined her at the window, following her gaze out toward the darkening grounds beyond. "What are you thinking of?" he asked softly. "That first evening," Eleanor admitted. "How different everything felt then. How certain I was that my story would continue unfolding exactly as it always had, quiet and overlooked, forever standing in my sister's shadow. I never could have imagined it would lead here, to this." "I am endlessly grateful it did," the Duke said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "Though I confess I wish that evening had never caused you such pain in the first place." "Perhaps," Eleanor said thoughtfully, "but I have come to believe that sometimes our greatest pain becomes the very thing that finally forces us to find our voice, to claim the courage we did not know we possessed, until circumstances demanded it of us. I would not wish that humiliation upon anyone, but I cannot regret where it ultimately led me." She turned to face her husband fully, her heart full to overflowing with everything the past months had brought her. The family healed of old wounds, the love she had never dared hope to find, the confidence in her own worth that no one could ever again diminish or take from her. "Thank you," she said simply, "for asking me to tell you more that evening, for seeing something worth knowing in a girl everyone else had overlooked for years." "Thank you," the Duke replied, his eyes shining with love and quiet wonder, "for having the courage to answer." Outside, the last light faded entirely from the winter sky, giving way to a canopy of brilliant stars above Ashford House, and within its walls, surrounded by family both old and newly healed, Eleanor Whitmore, now Duchess of Ashford, finally allowed herself to fully embrace the happiness she had spent so many years believing might never truly belong to her, secure at last in the knowledge that her story, far from ending in that moment of public humiliation, had only just truly begun.